up until this point, we've been talking about the different mechanisms for evolution to follow. Things like genetic drift, gene flow, preferred mating, mutation, etc. Now I want to talk a little bit about how this could eventually lead to another process known as speciation. Speciation is the formation of a new species from an existing species. So it's sort of how we find all the different diversity of forms in the world today, based on this speciation method. So when two populations are different enough from one another or separated by some form of barrier, the two groups of organisms in the same species, then once those barriers are formed, they can eventually become two separate species that are no longer able to mate with one another. And that's essentially the definition of a species. To be the member of the same species, you have to be able to sexually reproduce to produce viable, fertile offspring. Okay, both components being really important. Okay, the way that this happens are through reproductive isolation mechanisms. Okay, and there's two main groups of those. There's pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. Pre-zygotic is referring to all of the types of reproductive isolation mechanisms that occur before fertilization between a sperm and an egg can happen. Post-zygotic are the ones that have reproductive isolating mechanisms that occur after fertilization has occurred, and hence the name pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. So getting into some pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms. The first one is ecological isolations. And in a nutshell, just as you see here, they have to occupy different habitats. So you have the woodchuck at the sea level and the marmot in the alpine or the mountain region. So they've been separated ecologically, meaning the zones in which they live in don't cross over. So the likelihood of them encountering one another and being able to sexually reproduce is very, very low. And if enough time passes where they have no contact with one another, then they become two separate species. So the woodchuck and the marmot at one point were one species, but because of the lifestyles of where they lived, eventually enough things have changed now that they no longer produce fertile or viable offspring. The next mechanism is temporal isolation. So this is the time aspect. This primarily you see in plants and in some insects as well. So flowers that bloom, say, during the night versus flowers that bloom during the day. So some sort of mutation or mechanism due to where they exist. For say, I don't know, some of the flowers that bloom at night are dependent on nocturnal insects or animals to help spread pollen, whereas the ones during the day, obviously, with the diurnal insects. So because they bloom at different times of the day, then the pollen of the night flowers it's not highly likely that it's going to fertilize the flowers of the daytime. Okay, and this can also happen too, like with flowers that say bloom in the spring versus ones that bloom in the late summer. Because they bloom at different times, then the pollen is not available to one another. And this could be, again, due to some mutation or some other form of adaptation based on where they exist. The third type is behavioral isolation. So they have different ways of attracting mates. So for some reason, certain sexes are attracted to certain types of behaviors, like an elaborate dance or some sort of like I said, some sort of elaborate display. It would cause them to isolate that way. The other one would be song in birds. So some birds have certain songs that attract mates, whereas others have different ones. And the reason why this happens is it helps to decrease the likelihood of interbreeding. So if two songs or two birds look too similar, then you might have what you would generally assume is that they're more closely related. And again, you want to prevent interbreeding because of the loss of variability between inbred organisms. Okay, and then the next main type would be prevention of fertilization. So two main types, again, mechanical isolation, so unable to physically exchange gametes. So the genitals of one sort of group won't work, they don't fit properly with the other group. Again, this can happen over time. Mate selection, sexual selections, which happens in ducks. Female ducks have sort of a abnormally shaped vagina, like corkscrew style. And so males that don't have a similar shaped penis are less likely to be able to have this sperm fertilize the egg. That'd be one example. Another is gametic isolation. So the gametes are not recognized by the similar species. So they don't, the egg will not allow the sperm to enter into the egg, just again based on differences from being separated over a period of time. Same thing in plants. Pollen grains of one fail to germinate with the stigma of another species, and this again could happen over a period of time if they're separated for long enough. All right, now we're going to start talking about the post-zygotic mechanisms that help to lead to speciation. Okay, zygotic mortality is the first one. So the fertilized embryos just do not develop to maturity. So the parts fit, everything works, they can reproduce, they live in a similar region, and the sperm does fertilize the egg, but the embryos never develop. So I guess it would result in, it would be like a miscarriage. And this would happen 100% of the time. Another would be when you have a hybrid, so that's the offspring made by these two different species don't live very long. Okay, so the two types of fruit flies, the Drosophila melanogaster and Drosophila simulans, they can reproduce. The offspring are born, but they don't live for very long. And again, due to changes, these two species must have been separated for a period of time so that this no longer works. Another one would be hybrid infertility, and this is what we talked about in the last test. Offspring are strong but sterile. So again, you have the horse on the left over here, and you have the donkey on the right. Okay, and then when they can mate and everything works fine, they have a mule. The only problem is the mule, because of an odd number of diploid, number, will not produce two even haploid gametes, or four even haploid gametes, sorry, so that they're sterile. So it can't properly fertilize. You can't have two mules made to make another mule. Okay, now we're going to get into how the speciation actually can happen. Okay, there's two main types that we're going to get into in this course. There's a third type as well, which I may mention at the end, but you're not responsible for it. The two main types are sympatric speciation and allopatric speciation. Okay, sympatric speciation is when populations that live in the same habitat diverge genetically. Okay, whereas allopatric speciation is when populations are geographically separated by some kind of a barrier and then diverge genetically. Okay, so allopatric speciation we'll talk about first. This is more simpler of the two. So some sort of barrier forms. A river kind of pops up or something. This would happen, I guess, when you had Australia break off from Pangea. Okay, so a lot of the marsupials, if you compare marsupials to some of the organisms that live in South America, they are very similar, but also very different. They have anteaters. There's anteaters in Australia and anteaters in South America, but they have a lot of things that are significantly different. But you can see at one point they may have been one species. So when this geographical barrier, a mountain range or something pops up and the species are separated for a long enough period of time, then just through random genetic drift or mutations, any of the other things that sort of just happen in populations in general, happen for a long enough period of time that then they become completely different, separate species, and they're now reproductively isolated for whatever reason. The barrier doesn't have to be there forever or permanently, but if it's for a long enough period of time, then you'll have speciation. Sympatric species is when there is no barrier. They are also living in the same region, but for whatever reason they start to diverge genetically. Reason why this can happen, well, first of all, it's more common in plants than it is in animals, and the reason being that plants can be polyploidy, meaning they can have more than just two sets of chromosomes. Animals, you don't see very many examples of polyploidy, so it doesn't often happen. Polyploidy in animals usually results in death or an unviability. They're never even born. Polyploidy in plants, on the other hand, they can survive with polyploidy. And because of this polyploidy, if one plant one species then now has an extra set or two of the chromosomes, it can now be completely genetically separate from the other plants that formerly used to be members of the same species. It can also be caused by just a random mutation, something that pops up in a large portion of the population. So that's sympatric. Parapatric, just as I said before, you're not really responsible for, but it's important. I think it's important to still understand it. Is when the population is over a really, really large area, dispersed over a large area, so that the members of the species at the sort of the two poles of the area start to become significantly different from one another, just because it's so far for them to travel to mate that it doesn't happen very often. What you could have though in the middle is sort of a hybrid zone where these two species still interact. What this could eventually even possibly lead to is a sort of a third species over time, if the hybrids become significantly different from the other two. But because of, again, of this vast area, the gene flow is reduced, and then that's why you have speciation occurring.